In this tutorial, I'm going to look at the basics of animating effects using keyframes in Adobe Premiere. I'm going to start by putting a simple effect on this first clip here on my timeline, a blur effect, and then animating that blur effect so the shot goes from blurred into focus and then back out again to blurred. So the first part of this process is to add the relevant effect and then switch to the effects controls tab to get to its controls. So I'm just going to quickly move to my effects tab here. I'm still in the editing workspace at the moment, and I'm going to go into my video effects, open those up. Here's blur and sharpen, open those up, and for the purposes of this I'm going to use a Gaussian blur. I'm going to take the blur effect and drag it onto the clip itself. I'm going to keep the clip selected on the timeline. I'm going to come up top left here and click on the Effects Controls tab, which obviously is where we get to the controls for all of the effects on any selected clip on the timeline. And before I do any work here, I'm just going to optimize this window slightly. I'm going to make it a bit wider by moving to the divider between the Effects Controls window and the Program Monitor. So it's a little trim symbol up, drag to the right, and I'm just going to make that window a little bit wider. And I'm going to increase this area of it here, which is the keyframe timeline area within Effects Controls, which we're going to be using to do our animation. I'm going to make that a little bit wider by just moving to the edge of the timeline area and the controls area, so just to the right of where these reset buttons are, and drag that to the left slightly and just make this timeline area a bit bigger. Obviously in previous tutorials we've looked at intrinsic and added effects. I have just added a blur effect to this clip, so I'm just going to come up to the effects controls here. I'm just going to close up any of the intrinsic video effects, so motion, opacity, time remapping. There's the Gaussian blur, there's the intrinsic audio effects, volume, channel volume and pan. Obviously I want the Gaussian blur controls. We've previously looked at masking effects and changing the controls for effects, adding and removing effects, copy and pasting attributes, so please have a look back at the previous effects tutorials for those. So I'm going to assume you've already got that knowledge, and we're going to move straight into animating effects. So the control, first of all, that affects the amount of blur on the clip is this blurriness control. I can adjust that by either hovering over it so I get the little hand finger symbol and dragging to the right to increase the blur, or to the left to decrease it. One of the things about the blur effects on here is they make the edges of the frame semi-transparent. You see it sort of slightly darkens around the edges of the frame there. To get rid of that, you just tick repeat edge pixels and that will fill in the blur all the way to the edges of the frame. The other way I can do that obviously is just click in there and type in what I want. So let's set an initial blur amount of say 100 in there, which is quite blurred as you can see. We've got a timeline here where we do the animation side of things using what's termed keyframes, which I'll explain in just a second. There's a playhead on there, and there's also obviously the playhead on the timeline. These are effectively the same thing, so as you move one it moves the other, as you can see. The only difference is in this timeline, this only shows you the selected clip. So there's the start of the clip there, there's the end of the clip there, and you can see as I move all the way to the right or the left with the playhead in there, it's taking me to the start or the end of the selected clip on the timeline clip. And the playhead is very important because it's one of the primary ways of adding and removing keyframes is using the playhead itself and the position of the playhead. Which playhead you use really depends on what's easiest. If you're trying to line up with something on your timeline, it's easier to move the timeline one. So for example, if I was trying to line up with the start of another clip, let's say on the timeline, obviously I can't see it on this timeline here. I can see it on the timeline down there, so I can use that playhead. But if it's just say the start or the end of a clip, it's just as easier to use it up here. Another little thing just to mention, you have your sequence timecode down here on the timeline. There's also the same timecode down here in the bottom left hand corner of the effects control tab, and like the timeline one, if I want to, I can actually click in these time codes and type in a time code that I want to jump the playhead to. So just to show you, if I click in the timeline one here, just delete everything. If I say want to jump to 5 seconds on the timeline, I can ignore the hours and minutes. I would just type in 5 for seconds, and I have to remember to put my frames in, so 00 frames, hit enter, and that jumps the playhead, as you can see, to 5 seconds on the timeline. If I do the same in this little time code down here, I'll do 3 seconds this time. So 300, hit enter. That will jump the playhead there, as you can see, to 3 seconds on the timeline. So what I want to do is animate the blurriness amount of the clip itself. Initially, let's say I start with it as 100% on the first frame of the clip, and let's say switch it to 0 3 seconds into the clip. The way this works is you have to first of all turn on the ability to add a keyframe. There's a little stopwatch icon here next to all of the controls in the effect, and in fact every effect, whether it's an intrinsic or added effect, any of the controls that can be animated will have one of these little stopwatch icons next to them. The stopwatch icons have two roles. The first role is they turn on the ability to animate the control itself, and the second thing that they do is they initially add what's called a keyframe at the playhead position with this current value selected. So I'm going to click on the stopwatch here for blurriness there. As you can see, the stopwatch turns blue. There's some additional buttons now that have been activated, which we'll look at in a minute, and on the timeline here, on the keyframe timeline at the playhead position, you can see there's a little diamond. You can't see all of it at the minute because it's really close to the edge of the window, but there's a little blue diamond there. Look, I'll drag it out. That is a keyframe. Now, keyframes are the main way of animating anything in Premiere. It's also the same for After Effects. It's also the same for a lot of other video and audio and graphics animation packages. The way that keyframes work, and the best way of sort of thinking about them, is imagine they're like a snapshot of a value at a certain frame in time. On the first frame of that clip now, it has set a snapshot of that blurriness value at a value of 100. Once you've set this initial keyframe, to add additional keyframes and therefore animate between different values, in this case of the blurriness, all you do is move your playhead along to where you want the next keyframe, or snapshot if you like, to occur, and change the value. So I said I want the blurriness to be back to no blur 3 seconds into the clip. So I'm going to move my playhead along to 3 seconds, which is there. I'm just looking at the time code down here or down here. I'm going to go to the blurriness value, click in it, enter 0. Now as soon as I hit return or enter, you will see a new keyframe appear at the playhead position. There it is, and that has added a second keyframe, or snapshot if you like, with the blurriness value at 0. If I now bring the playhead back to the start of the clip and play you that, you will see the blur gradually disappears between those two keyframes. Once you know how to turn the initial keyframe option on and add additional keyframes, you can animate anything that has a stopwatch icon next to it in the effects controls window. Obviously there is a little bit more to it, which I'm going to go into now, making some amendments now to our animation. So the first thing you might want to do is change the timing of the animation. So let's say I want the blur to disappear more quickly, and let's say also that I want it to hold that initial blur of 100 for a bit longer, let's say for the first second of the clip. Now to do that bit, first of all, what we would need to do is simply move that first keyframe 1 second into the clip. So if I just put my playhead there as a guide, so I'm going to bring my playhead 1 second in, there, as you can see on the time code here or here. Click on the start keyframe there and simply drag it along the timeline. As you're doing this, it should snap when it hits the playhead position. So now what that's done, because there's no other keyframes before this one, it's going to hold that 100 value up to the new position of the start keyframe. It will obviously then go from 100 to 0 between the two keyframes here, and because they're closer together, it's taking less time to do that. That would speed up the animation. There we go. You see it loses the blur more quickly. If I just play it again, and it holds that initial blur for longer. If I wanted to speed it up even more, I'll move the keyframes closer together again. So let's maybe say take that second keyframe. I'm going to bring my playhead to 2 seconds, and I'm going to shift and click on it and just drag the end one back there to 2 seconds and stop. If I play that now, it will hold 100 for 1 second. It will lose the blur much more quickly now over the next second. Okay, so retiming an animation is really simple. If you want to speed it up, bring your keyframes closer together. If you want to slow it down, move the keyframes further apart. And now what I would like it to do is hold no blur for the middle section of the clip, and then go from no blur back to 100 again towards the end of the clip. So the main thing here that I want to get across is actually how to create the hold, because we already know how to create additional keyframes. You just move your playhead along to where you want your next one and change the value. So look, if I bring my playhead over here, change the blur value back to 100, that would add the new end keyframe of 100. So the blur is going to go back to 100, but the animation always works from keyframe to keyframe. So instead of it holding the 0 value here through the middle of the clip, it's going to start to change from this keyframe here at 0 back to 100. There'll be no hold. So look, here we go, 100 down to 0, and then straight away it's going blurry again and back to 100. So how do we create a hold? Now there's two main ways of doing this, and it really all just depends on whether you've already got a new keyframe going on as we have here. So let me show you the method that will deal with this situation first. To create a hold in a value with keyframes, what you need is two keyframes at the start and the end of the hold that have exactly the same value. So if I wanted to hold the 0 value, let's say to where my playhead is now on the timeline, I need another keyframe where the playhead is with the same value as this one, i.e. 0. And a simple way of doing that is you just copy and paste an existing keyframe into a new position. So I'm going to select the keyframe here with the value of 0. I'm going to do a copy, so I'm on a Mac, so Command C, I could be doing Control C if I was on a PC. Place the playhead where I want the copied keyframe to be pasted, and then simply do a paste. So Command V on a Mac, Control V on a PC, there we go, Command V, and that has now pasted in a new keyframe with the value of 0. As you can see, there's no blur again. If I play you it again now, it should go from blurred into focus, hold, and then back to blurred again. Okay, so that's one way of creating a hold, and that works no matter what the circumstances. I'm just going to delete the two end keyframes. Deleting keyframes, there's two main ways of doing it. The simple way is you select the keyframe and you just hit backspace. If you've got more than one keyframe to select, you can click and draw a lasso, just click and drag your mouse over them, it will select more than one, and then just do a backspace to delete them. Okay, so we're back to our initial animation now, where it goes from blurred into focus. I'm going to park the playhead again where I want the end of the hold to occur. Now, in this scenario, because we haven't got another keyframe further up the timeline, we're still at a blur value of 0. It hasn't changed. Whereas before, when we had that extra keyframe in, it was already going blurred again at this point. In this scenario, where nothing has changed, there's a slightly quicker way of generating that new keyframe. And it's by using this button here, which is the Add and Remove Keyframe button. Now this button activates when you turn on your stopwatch. If I click this button, what it will do is at the playhead position, create a new keyframe at whatever value that parameter is currently set to at that point in time. So because nothing had changed, that was still set to 0, so it's now created a new keyframe at 0. I've got the hold back again, then I can just move the playhead forwards again, change that back to 100, and we've got the lose the blur into focus and then back to blurred again. We've got the hold back. Now that one only works where nothing has changed. In the first scenario, where obviously things were already changing at this point, where I wanted the hold keyframe, then the copying and pasting one works. And in fact, I could have done the copy and paste on this one as well. It's just clicking that button is slightly quicker than selecting copying and pasting. You might have noticed also there's a couple of little arrows next to this button. Now what these allow you to do is they allow you to jump your playhead by clicking on the left or the right arrow from keyframe to keyframe in the timeline there. And there's two reasons that you would want to do that. The first one is deleting a keyframe. So I've already shown you the quick way of deleting keyframes, but another way is if you park your playhead on a keyframe and you hit the add or remove keyframe button, if there's a keyframe already there, it removes it. If there isn't one there, it will add one. I'm just going to undo that just to get the 1 at 100 back again. The other reason for jumping to a keyframe and being parked on a keyframe is if you want to change the value of a keyframe. And this is really important. Remember, if your playhead is in an area where there isn't a keyframe and you make a change, it creates a new keyframe. So it's vitally important that if you want to update the value of a keyframe, your playhead is slap bang on that keyframe. And these little arrows here guarantee that that will be so. So if I go to this end keyframe here, and let's say I decide I want a blur value, change that to a blur value of 200, I jump to it using the little button so I know I'm on the actual keyframe itself. You can also tell that by the fact that the add keyframe button is blue. That means you're parked on a keyframe. And then I'm just going to go in and I'm just going to change the value to 200, and that has then updated that keyframe for me. Once you've got the keyframes there, if you did want to just get rid of all the keyframes, if you hit the stopwatch again, and it will warn you saying, look, do you really want to do this? Delete the existing keyframes. If I go OK, can you see that turns it all off?